All right, we're going to conclude our lectures on the history of thought with a discussion of the postmodern world. And there's only going to be one lecture for this section, for this unit, not because it's less important, but for two reasons. Number one, it's pretty complex. And if you are dismayed by that because you found some of the previous units complex, I'm sorry. I will do the best I can to boil this down to its essential characteristics. But there are some fairly technical arguments that some of these thinkers are making. So we're just going to just graze the tip of the iceberg on it. Secondly, we are living in the postmodern world. And I don't know if there's as much historical distance between some of these thinkers and ideas in our own time in order for us to understand how important these ideas have been and what impact they've made on society. So we are going to discuss several disjointed aspects of the postmodern world in one lecture, and we'll do the best that we can. Some of the things I want the student to get out of this lecture is I want the student to be able to identify some of the weaknesses of the Enlightenment Project, of the modern period. I'd like the student to be able to give a very brief and general description of the essential characteristics of postmodern thought. Most importantly, I think I would like the student to be able to evaluate the contributions of postmodern thought to the Christian life. Was it helpful or was it not helpful? I think the church has been highly critical of postmodern thought for good reason at times. But since postmodern thought is still emerging, still evolving, I think the church is more comfortable slapping one label on the entire movement instead of evaluating its different components separately. Because I do think that there are some things in the postmodern movement that would be helpful to the Christian in understanding God, scriptures, and the world around us. Let me begin by offering a brief overview of why there needed to be a postmodern thought. Obviously, postmodern is that which comes after the modern period. Why did the modern period end? Why did the Enlightenment come to a close? The Enlightenment was developed on the premise that we can observe the world around us. It operates according to mechanical principles that can be predicted. And B, we have the rational capacity to make sense of all those observations. The Enlightenment, it's called the Enlightenment Project because the modern period generated this expectation that through observation and through reason, we were going to be able to figure out the whys of everything in the universe. And we would have no more need for mystery. We would have no more need for superstition. That science would triumph and explain everything for us. During the Enlightenment period, during the modern period, a number of things became more clear to us as a civilization about the human body and heavenly bodies and the natural world and so many things. But there was this expectation that the more knowledge we would gain, the more it would lead to a better society, this idea of progress, that we are going to get better and better and better and better. And I think the Enlightenment Project failed, A, because of historical reasons, B, because of theological reasons. Historically, the Enlightenment and this idea of progress was alive and well through the 19th century, but once we get into the 20th century, there's a couple of events that happened that calls this idea of progress into question. And one small illustration of this is the sinking of the Titanic. The Titanic was billed as man's triumph over nature. One newspaper reporter even claimed that God himself could not sink the ship. And there was a sense that all of these natural obstacles in this world we were, rapidly overcoming with our ability to reason. And That did not work out so well. The Titanic almost inexplicably was sunk on its maiden voyage, and it calls into question this idea of, hey, are we really as powerful in this world as we have been led to believe as a result of the modern period? Probably more important of a historical event that called this idea of a better society into question was World War I and the unthinkable atrocities that occurred in that period. We were using brand new technology that this modern period had invented in order to destroy our enemies, but we're using 18th and 19th century tactics. So, we're marching thousands of people in a line against the enemy, which may have worked when you had a musket and it took 3 to 5 seconds to reload. Now that we have automatic weapons that can fire, over 100 rounds a minute, that did not work out well for people. This same philosophical system that led us to believe there'd be a utopian society also developed mustard gas and the ability to kill people in horrible, horrible ways. World War II, the nuclear age, all these conspired to call into question this idea of progress, call into question whether or not the Enlightenment could deliver on its promises. Theologically speaking, I think the Enlightenment failed because we bought into this idea of human agency to such an extent that we lost a sense of the effect that sin has on our lives. These traditional historic Christian truths were now being replaced by scientific conclusions and perspectives, and this underlying idea that man is generally good and that man can rightly observe the world around us. A historic understanding of the Christian faith lets us know that man is not generally good, that man has this inherent corruption that actually steers us towards evil more often than it steers us towards good. Romans chapter 3, there's none righteous, no, not one. There's none who understands God. There's none who seek after God. There is none righteous, no, not one. That this idea that we are all predisposed to doing the wrong thing. You don't have to teach a baby how to do something bad. You have to teach a baby how to do something good, right? Another aspect of this doctrine of original sin is called the noetic effects of sin, the effect of sin on our understanding. And because we are fallen beings, according to historic Christianity, it impairs, A, our ability to see the world around us correctly, and B, it impairs our ability to rightly think about that world. And during the modern period, there was a sense that these two historic Christian approaches had been lost. And it generated this expectation that we can produce a utopian society, we can overcome nature, we can do many, many things. And in the Bible, that traditionally does not work out well for us. One of the clearest examples of this was the Tower of Babel, where we thought through human ingenuity and human reason that we can build a tower to heaven. Looking back on it now, that sounds somewhat absurd and somewhat crazy, but it made sense to those people somehow. It was logical and rational, and God was not really pleased with that approach to the world around this group, and it had some fairly severe consequences. So I believe that the modern project, the Enlightenment Project, failed because it failed to recognize some historic Christian truths, and this was illustrated in historical circumstances, such as the sinking of the Titanic and the World Wars. This failure of the Enlightenment was observed by several early 20th century thinkers. And as a Christian, I would say that their observations about the modern period are accurate, but they tried to put something in place of it that I do not believe is very helpful. And the first figure that fits this mold is Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche understood that the Enlightenment could not deliver on its promises. And he took issue with the objective nature of knowledge, the objective nature of truth. Instead, he thought truth was subjective. He held to a position known as perspectivism, that every individual person has their own unique perspective on what truth is. So truth is not an external objective absolute, it was an internal subjective perspective. So if you get 30 people in a room that all saw a car accident, they would give 30 different accounts of what happened in that car accident. And therefore since there's not objective observation, there cannot be objective truth. Nietzsche discussed this in his book Beyond Good and Evil. And in rejecting the objective nature of truth, if he rejects these Kantian innate categories with which we all understand the world together, Nietzsche was able to also take down the Kantian idea of a categorical moral imperative. This idea that everyone is subject to the same moral law. So he rejected objective truth, he rejected objective moral code, and instead, in his next book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and Will to Power, he tried to put something else in its place, that the goal is not, for an individual, is not recognizing this objective truth, it's taking your perspective on truth, taking your own truth, and being able to impose it on other people. The ability to take your will in order to achieve maximum pleasure, in order to achieve maximum power. That was the goal of the moral life, if we want to call it, that. And obviously, this perspective ran against the grain to what Christianity and the church was promoting, and not just in Nietzsche's time, but in all time. So even though Nietzsche was never a Christian, he came out and declared that God is dead. And this was a symbol that there is no such thing as objective truth. There is no such thing as an objective moral code. There's no such thing as an objective authority structure. And we had always appealed to God as being the foundation for truth, morality, and authority. So if we throw out those three, well, then God must be dead. He is no longer relevant to our society. And another one of these answers that Nietzsche tried to put in place of the Enlightenment Project was the idea of the Übermensch, that the Superman, once we as a race of people rid ourselves of these enslaving ideas like objective truth and universal moral code and authority structures, then we can evolve into a higher functioning society. It is not hard to see how Nietzsche's thought fueled the Third Reich, fueled ideas like eugenics and such. While Nietzsche may have been correct in recognizing the failure of the Enlightenment Project, I don't believe his answer, his solution is very helpful. I have significant problems with throwing out the idea of absolute truth, throwing out the idea of a universal moral code or authority structures. Nietzsche wasn't the only one to question the Enlightenment Project. There was another group of people known as the Existentialists that also adopted more of a subjective view of the world. The core belief in existentialism is that humanity, a person, is a whole. That includes reason, emotions. You can't separate, this is a rational part of a human, this is an emotional part of a human. It is a unified whole, and this subject, this person, gets confused when he looks at the world and sees the world that's not unified, that sees the world that is divided and in conflict with one another, and the subject sees this as absurdity. So the existentialists generated a very unique approach to the world around him or her. Although it is interesting that the first true existentialist was a Christian, a guy named Soren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard believed that the individual is responsible for recognizing meaning to life. It is not the job of society to provide meaning to life. It's not even the role of religion to provide meaning to life. It is the individual, this unified whole of reason and emotions and all that, to make sense of the world around him. And this level of authenticity, this level of passion, this level of sincerity was only possible in relation to Christ. Okay? It's Christ that made one whole. It's Christ that made society whole. It's not government or religion that gives meaning to Christ. Christ gives meaning to us as individuals. Okay? And that's a very interesting way to approach this idea of existentialism. And it's been very attractive in the postmodern era. A lot of people have gone back to Kierkegaard to avoid the problems that authority structures and institutions have created. The Enlightenment thought that these institutions would help develop a utopian society. Many times these institutions fueled terror and inhumane acts. So going back to the self, the individual, was very attractive to Christians in order to avoid the problem of institutions. Not everyone who bought into these core existentialist beliefs were as optimistic as Kierkegaard was. Another guy, John Paul Sartre, was an existentialist. His contribution was this idea that existence preceded essence, that the fact that you exist is prior to any sense of why we are here. And this eliminated any appeal to a final causation or a telos. It's not about where we're going as a society or what our destiny may be, but hey, here we are, and we don't exactly know why. We know that we are a unified whole. The world around us is not unified, it's in conflict, and it seems absurd. Therefore, any meaning you assign to the world is arbitrary. Therefore, everything is basically absurd. If you can admit that we have any existence outside of a purpose, then everything is arbitrary and everything is absurd. This is the application of existential principles without the inclusion of Christ in there. So to a certain extent, Sartre is not necessarily wrong. If you eliminate God and Jesus in particular as a source of meaning, then what meaning is there? How does this world fit together? What is our purpose here? So, in that, Sartre's not necessarily wrong. It's just incomplete. And that's a theme throughout this postmodern era. Postmodernity is not necessarily wrong or inaccurate, but it is incomplete. It does not provide alternative solutions to the problems that they acutely identify. So we've talked about objectivity and subjectivity. This perspective was applied to a very unique area of philosophy, the philosophy of language. How is it that we derive meaning from language? When we talk, is the meaning in my head able to be translated to meaning in your head through words? And this was questioned by a number of people. One of the first guys to question this was a guy named Ludwig Wittgenstein, who I apparently only included because I like saying his name. No, Wittgenstein is incredibly important to understanding postmodern thought. In the same way that Nietzsche thought that truth and morality was not absolute, Wittgenstein thought that language was not absolute, but language was based on experience. So when I talk about roads, I have an idea in my head of what a road is or should be, what an actual road looks like. Let's say there's a person from Central Africa or some other part of the world listening to this lecture, and I say the word road. The picture that appears in your head might be vastly different than the picture that appears in my head. So is communication happening there? Does road have an absolute meaning, or do we just assign meaning to the symbol ROAD based on our experience with roads? Wittgenstein called these language games that, like when I say roads, it has meaning to my particular community. But it does not necessarily have meaning to someone in another language community, okay? So, if I lived in New York City and if I talked about the roads or the highways, well, people in New York City know what I'm talking about because we have a common base of experience. But people in Australia or Japan may not know what I'm referring to because their realm of experience assigns different meaning to that symbol. Therefore, since truth and morality are wrapped up in experience, in the experience of local communities, then one community can't impose truth on another community. Some people accuse postmodernism of looking at truth as relative to the individual. And Nietzsche did promote that somewhat, but in fairness, that's not what postmodernity has agreed to in respect to truth. The postmodern world does not see truth as relative or individual to every single person. Postmodernism sees truth as pluralistic and may have meaning within individual communities, but these meanings are separate in different communities. So we're going to talk about truth as pluralistic, not truth as relative. Okay, and to a certain extent, Wittgenstein wasn't wrong. We do assign different meanings to words based on our experience with them. Now, road may be not as much of a helpful example, but how about love? I love my children. I do not beat my children. I have other ways in which I discipline them, but I see my discipline as an act of love. When I had a chance to visit Africa, I was really taken aback at seeing, how some teachers treated these children when they were late to school. They'd line them up and take a large wooden rod and kind of go to town. I mean, it was pretty jarring to me. And, I had an opportunity to ask some of my Kenyan friends about this, and they said, no, this is an act of love. This is how we love our children. Didn't look like love to me. I mean, I understand theoretically the concept of you discipline in order to love, but I did not see this carried out in a spirit of love at all. But I don't think I'm in a position to say that, well, that's not love. I mean, that doesn't match up with my experience or definition of that's not love. We see a lot of cases in homes that experience domestic violence, that a husband will beat his wife and the cops are called and the wife refuses to press charges because the wife, for whatever reason, believes that that is an expression of love. Love is, the idea of love is generated on experience to one extent or another. Later on, we will evaluate that claim to see if there's a better way of looking at it. But I think at its foundation, Wittgenstein is not wrong, or at least he's not crazy to develop the idea of, communities of truth, communities where language makes sense. Another guy who had a lot to say about the nature of language in this period is a guy named Levi-Strauss. And Levi-Strauss developed an approach to language we term structuralism. Structuralism is the belief that meaning is connected to overarching themes of interrelated ideas. And this meaning is generated through three steps. There's the sign, like the actual word, the sign, the thing it signifies, and then the abstract concept. Like I said, this can be highly technical and hard to understand. But according to Levi-Strauss, we assign meaning to a sign. So let's say the sign is A-P-P-L-E, apple, right? I'm from Central New York. I prefer Gala apples. When I think of an apple, I think of an apple as red. Whereas in Washington, you might assign a different meaning to an apple to think of apples as something that are green. And maybe most illustrative is maybe in Silicon Valley, when you say apple, you don't get the image of a fruit at all. You get an image of a piece of technology, that we assign meaning to these signs, and there's no absolute connection with the sign of something and that which is signified. That's an arbitrary connection. So we can make Apple refer to a chair or anything we wanted, as long as we as a community agreed on that. So this is a variation of Wittgenstein, but Wittgenstein saw the meaning of a word as a product of a natural product of experience, not something necessarily arbitrary. Levi-Strauss sees language as an arbitrary designation of something. It's not that we just happen to run into or experience Appleness and use the APPLE sign to refer to it. No, we actively choose, this is what we're going to call red, this is what we're going to call blue, this is what we're going to call chair, this is what we're going to call this. So words and language are not absolute and universal. They are inherent to a community, and their meaning is arbitrary. This led to another thinker, a guy named Jacques Derrida. And while Levi-Strauss promoted structuralism, Derrida promoted post-structuralism. All of them recognize there is a problem in developing absolute meaning from language. When you say apple, it does not evoke the same abstract concepts in one's head for everyone equally. It's different. And since this connection between the word and the thing it signifies is arbitrary, you can have varying interpretations of that. So for Jacques Derrida, this led him to develop what's called reader response theory, or deconstructionism. Meaning can be in one of three different places when you read something. We can say the meaning is in the author's intent. And when we read words, our job is to find the author's intent. We can say meaning is found in the words themselves. Or we can say meaning is derived from the reader. Now, saying that meaning is derived from the author's intent is somewhat problematic because we don't necessarily have access to the intent of the author. The only access we have is to the words he or she wrote. And if those words are arbitrary in their meaning, that means they mean whatever we think it means, this pure presence. So according to Jacques Derrida, it's the reader that assigns meaning. That meaning is not found in the text itself. It's not found in the author's intent. And since the meaning is found in the reader, you have as many meanings as you have readers. I find it interesting that in the book that Derrida described this thought, he received a fairly negative review in the New York Times and wrote a fairly lengthy letter explaining how to this author how he was misunderstood by the author. I think that's humorous, because if meaning is truly in the reader and not the text, well then Derrida's book is whatever the New York Times reviewer thought it was. But this obviously has some far-reaching consequences for Christianity. I mean, we are a religion built on a text, and if this text doesn't have absolute meaning and we provide the meaning, we can no longer talk about Christianity. We have to start talking about Christianities, that everyone has their own version of Christianity based on the meaning you assign to it. Obviously, this is problematic to the Christian church. This lack of universal truth, moral code, lack of universal language to express ideas was summed up in postmodernism's writings on what's called a meta-narrative. A meta-narrative is this large, overarching theme that gives every individual narrative meaning. And in the Enlightenment period, their project was to make sense of all these individual pieces of knowledge by fitting it in this one overarching meta-narrative. Because postmodernism saw truth as subjective, pluralistic, because there was a loss of absolute meaning there was a widespread rejection of the meta-narrative. And this guy, Jean-Francois Lyotard, was a Canadian philosopher, and the government actually commissioned him to write a summary on what postmodernity is. And he tried to sum it up as best as he could for non-specialists. And the bumper sticker phrase for postmodernity we get from Lyotard is incredulity toward meta-narratives, a rejection of any universal or overarching meaning to life, any overarching meaning to language, any overarching meaning to the world. Language cannot provide meaning, the individual cannot provide meaning, or religion or God could not provide meaning. And the post-structuralists are the ones that threw out the idea that language can provide meaning. The existentialists threw out this idea that the individual can provide his own meaning. And Nietzsche threw out the idea that God could provide meaning or religion. This is problematic for the Christian because we believe in a meta-narrative that our world has meaning because God provides meaning for this narrative, for this world. So we cannot agree with the postmoderns who throw out meta-narratives, but we can agree that it's not the individual that provides meaning. We can agree that it's not language that provides meaning. We can agree that it's not society or even religion as institutionally defined that provides meaning. As Christians, we can agree with postmodernists is that if you're looking for meaning in these places, you're not going to find it. Okay? So that is one way in which Christianity and postmodernity actually can resonate well with each other. Another way in which postmodernity and Christianity can resonate well with one another, so that we can both agree that the Enlightenment Project failed. The idea that man has the capability of rightly understanding the world around us and reasoning about that world apart from the effects of sin, postmodernism and Christianity agree. You're right. That is a project doomed to failure. We can agree with postmodernity that the Enlightenment failed because it was too ambitious and did not recognize core truths about who we are as human beings. We also have to agree with postmodernity that the individual, the self, is more than just reason. Our central defining characteristic is not necessarily detached reason, but God created us with emotions and feelings and all different aspects of the self that all have to cooperate together. That, I believe, is a more helpful biblical picture of who God created us to be. My undergrad philosophy professor had a very interesting idea that stuck with me for all these years. Another thing that postmodernity and Christianity can agree on is the nature of language. Not that language is arbitrary or meaningless or pluralistic, but when Wittgenstein said that our ideas, our language, is a product of our experience, I don't see a problem with that. Like we said before with this concept of love, that we generate ideas of love or justice or what have you based on our experience with love and our experience with justice. Now, that is not what determines what love is. As Christians who believe in a meta-narrative, we believe God gives meaning to the world. So if we want to rightly understand love, we need an experience with divine love. Not an intellectual exercise, but an experience with divine love. Or maybe I should rephrase it, not merely an experience, an intellectual experience. We can read God's word as an intellectual experience and learn a little bit more about what love is, but I don't think an individual can truly understand what love is until we have an experience with divine love. And that experience may be different, may contrast one's experience with love in one's family or in one's marriage or what have you. I think these are some ways in which Christianity and postmodernity can work well together. Like I said before, the critiques that postmodernity made of the modern period, I think, is very helpful to Christians. But postmodernity in and of itself has not been able to provide any answers. But I mean, that makes sense. If you take away this overarching meta-narrative and leave it up to the individual or the individual community to generate meaning for themselves, that's not a good answer. Or at least it's not an answer that's in any way consistent with the Christian faith and with the Christian scriptures. But as Christians, we can affirm the problems postmodernism had with the modern period while providing a different answer. And I think if we just kind of slap this one kind of generic label on anything that is postmodern as just being, bad, we're gonna miss out on understanding our world correctly, and we're gonna miss out on an opportunity to engage the world around us rightly. I know this was fairly complex. I know this was fairly brief in its presentation. But again, these lectures are designed to be a starting point for understanding the world around us and how other people have engaged the world around us, both Christian and non-Christian. This is by no means your philosophical destination. Please use this as a jumping off point to dig into these ideas, to dig into these approaches, and be able to think rightly about them. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to sit down and record these lectures. I'm sure that there's a lot here that was not presented as clearly as it could be. I'm sure that there were many errors made along the way, but it's something that I look to redo and improve several times before I